is a 2000 Cadillac Escalade, the original Escalade, the first generation. If I was making a list of the cars in my lifetime that have had the biggest impact on the car world and also the overall culture, the Escalade would be right near the top. This wasn't the first big luxury SUV, but it definitely had the biggest impact. And here now, 25 years after this came out, it's still a very recognizable brand name. Today I'm going to review the original Escalade and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this original Escalade is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a lifetime California car and it's unmodified, which is pretty hard to find with one of these, and it's being offered live on Cars and Bids with no reserve. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Escalade where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the original Escalade, a big deal car, although it's not because this was the first. By the late 90s, when the Escalade came out in 99, luxury SUVs had already started to show up. You had the Infiniti QX4 in 96, the Mercedes M-Class in 98, the Lexus RX was already out. There were already luxury SUVs, but the vast majority of the ones that existed were smaller, two-row little crossovers, or the big ones like the Range Rover were heavily focused on their off-road capabilities. Neither was true of the Escalade, and that's more what the big luxury SUV world looks like today. However, the Escalade wasn't even first to that. The Lincoln Navigator actually came out first for the 98 model year, 1 year ahead of the Cadillac Escalade. The Escalade, coming out in 99, followed the Navigator to market, but obviously in the ensuing years, it is the Escalade that has become the bigger success in terms of sale numbers, profit, and obviously its cultural icon status. The Escalade, star of so many rap videos and professional athletes, celebrities, musicians, they didn't want a Navigator, they wanted the Escalade. Now, the original Cadillac Escalade was then, and frankly still is to a degree, just a Chevy Tahoe that was dressed up to make it more luxurious than the more affordable kind of everyman Chevy brand SUV. That's how they created the Escalade at the time, and that's basically what they still do now. However, the modern day Escalade is so disguised and different and thoroughly revised from the Tahoe, you might have a hard time telling that the two vehicles share anything. But back then, the disguise was a lot more thin. And in fact, that was especially true of the GMC Yukon Denali, which came out the year before the Escalade and incorporated a lot of the Escalade's styling touches that made it more luxurious. The Yukon Denali was the beginning of GMC's luxury Denali brand, and it looked largely the same as the Escalade on the outside, with only a few trim differences. Both were different from the Tahoe, but the Yukon Denali and the Escalade, they weren't that different from each other. It was the beginning of this luxury SUV. So, what made this luxury? How do you take a Chevy Tahoe, a pretty standard truck-based, body-on-frame, popular SUV, and turn it into a luxury vehicle? Well, on the outside, that meant starting with body-colored everything. The Tahoe had black plastic on the outside. A lot of them were two-tone color schemes. The Escalade was all body-colored, so you can see everywhere you look, body-colored, the same gold that's on the mirrors, the doors, the lower panels, everywhere you have body color. And that was even true of trim pieces that in other GM SUVs would have been plastic or chromed or something else. Like, for instance, your door handles on the outside, your rear bumper, it was all made in body color to give the general look of a more luxurious, more classy vehicle, and and not sort of this two-tone kind of pickup truck derived thing. They also gave the Escalade slightly softer styling than the Tahoe. They didn't make major changes to the overall look, but like the front end isn't quite as sharp. It has a little bit rounder edges, sort of fitting what you might expect with a Cadillac rather than, again, a truck-based Chevrolet. And they did a little more than that. You have running boards on the Escalade, as you can see. It wasn't on all of the Tahoe models, but it made it easier to climb in and out. You have chrome wheels, as you can see, and they took the step of covering up the lug nuts on the chrome wheels to make it especially classy and high-end. Although it's worth pointing out they also did that on Tahoe models from this generation. It was a very nice General Motors touch, a nod to style over function, and it worked especially on the Escalade. You will also notice a pretty decent amount of exterior badging to announce to people that this was a Cadillac Escalade. On the doors you can see Cadillac written out and printed in a fairly large size, and same deal on the tailgate in back. You get the Cadillac logo and Escalade also written out. They didn't go too crazy. It's not like it says Escalade all over the back, but they went as far as they felt they could for a luxury vehicle in order to get the badging and the branding out there. Now, one thing you do not see on these early Escalade models is a big grille. Even though that has become a hallmark of the Escalade in later years, the early one just sort of replaced the Chevy grille with a Cadillac grille, and it didn't get a lot bigger. They weren't trying to really be in your face with the grille design. That all came later. But while the exterior differed from the Tahoe, you could tell it apart pretty easily, the interior was an even more significant change from the Chevy models. You climbed in and the first thing you saw were these big leather overstuffed seats up front. You can see not just leather upholstery, but also perforated leather down the seat centers, and you had the Cadillac Reef and Crest logo embroidered into the headrests, which added to the classy flair of the interior. You also had wood trim in here, which was a nice luxury touch. On the door panel, you can see wood trim all throughout the center, and then that was carried over to the steering wheel where you had wood trim top and bottom. There was some wood trim on the dashboard going around all of the controls, and you even had wood trim in the center console where you also had the Cadillac script written out and integrated into the wood trim next to these storage trays. Might not seem like much by modern standards, some leather upholstery and wood trim, but back in the day, these big SUVs, they didn't have stuff like this, and all these changes made it really nice. And there were a lot of luxury features in the Escalade too. For one, heated seats, which would have been a big deal. The switch is down here on the side. It's kind of odd. You can't see whether it's on or off, but it's there, and a nice touch on a luxury SUV. You also had a rear view mirror that had a compass or a temperature gauge. Depending on what you wanted, you could choose, select whatever you wanted to see. In the center control stack, of course, you have air conditioning, a stereo. You also have a CD player integrated into here, which in the late 90s really was the domain of some pretty luxurious vehicles. Standard on the Escalade made it feel especially high-end. Up above, you had an overhead center console, as you can see, and that integrated several nice luxury features, including home link for your garage door opener. That was a big deal back then. You also had GM's OnStar telecommunication system. If you needed help or just restaurant reservations, you could press that button. There were some storage compartments in here too, but you also had rear climate controls in the front with this little dial, the rear climate dial. That was another nice luxury feature of the Escalade. And it continued. You also had a full center console in the Escalade, which seems like nothing by modern standards, but back in the day, a lot of big SUVs had front bench seats, actually a seat here in the middle, rather than a full center console, which in this case had some storage compartments, cup holders, and even a full center storage area that locked. So you could lock it, unlock it like a glove box. And when you open it up, you can see it includes a 6-disc CD changer, which would have been true luxury in the era of this Escalade. And the nice touches in here went beyond just obvious features that of course you'd want on a luxury car. There was also some decent attention to detail. For example, in the center control stack, you look under and you can see a cigarette lighter style power outlet flanked by these two panels. Open them and there are two additional cigarette lighter style power outlets in here, so you could charge all of the devices that, well, didn't exist yet yet, but it was forward thinking by General Motors for a luxury car. Same deal with this little panel. It looks like a tiny storage compartment, but you open it up and it has fold-out cup holders, 2 additional cup holders in addition to the 2 in the center console. You also have this extra panel down here, which is another storage compartment. Some of those were on Chevy models, but it was still good to have in here. Another nice touch in here, the center console storage lid wasn't just a lid, it was also a padded armrest. They didn't just make it plastic, they gave you this sort of padded leather piece. It was a nice place to put your arm, and you had an additional armrest on the seats integrated into the seats themselves, which also added to your comfort in this Escalade. And there was more. The gear selector, this big old column shifter thing, at the end they wrapped it in leather that matched the leather color of the seats and the steering wheel to give you a slightly classier feel when you were shifting into gear. And they even put this little plastic pad here next to the ignition switch so that when you put your keys in, if you miss the switch or if your key fob dangled down, it wouldn't scratch or damage the steering column, which was a pretty nice luxury touch. You gotta hand it to General Motors for thinking of some of these things to add to the luxury of this interior. Now, one other thing you will note here in the center control stack, well, for one, a switch to turn on the fog lights, which was another nice luxury touch of the Escalade, but below that, you have the 4-wheel drive system. Now, all of these original Escalade models came with 4-wheel drive, and the interesting thing here is you can select 4-wheel drive high or 4-wheel drive low, which was common at the time, but there was also an auto 4-wheel drive setting that you could turn on, and then the car would operate more like it had all-wheel drive, meaning it was rear-wheel drive until it detected slippage, then it would start working as a 4-wheel drive system. That was pretty cutting edge and a pretty luxurious touch that you could just leave it in auto and let the system work it out for you, and you could switch into that with these buttons here. No lever you have to pull, no hubs you have to lock, just little buttons on the dashboard. That's pretty nice. Now, speaking of powertrain, it's worth mentioning that all of these original Escalade models came with the General Motors 5.7-liter Vortec V8. Same engine that was in the Tahoe. It made about 255 horsepower, which was pretty light. Lincoln, for the Navigator, decided to debut their Intech 5.4-liter V8, was far more advanced and made 300 horsepower, a pretty significant boost over the original Escalade, but this is what you got in the Escalade, just the Chevy Tahoe V8, until a couple years later they came out with a new model with a bigger engine and more power. But anyway, next we move into the back seat of the original Escalade, which the moment you climb in, you again notice full leather upholstery back here with these overstuffed, comfortable leather seats, perforated leather down the centers, as you can see, and the embroidered, stitched Cadillac logo into the headrests, just like what you have up front. Also a very classy atmosphere in back, and a surprisingly large amount of equipment and luxury features back here too. Starting with the obvious, you can see stereo controls back here, and in fact, you could plug in headphones, rear passengers could, and have a distinctly different audio experience from what was happening in the rest of the car. So rear passengers had their own audio capabilities thanks to these controls back here. That was pretty cool. Also impressive back here, heated rear seats, which would have been a huge deal back in 2000. Basically, no cars had this back then, even Range Rovers, G-Wagons. That was a really nice, really luxurious touch, also paired with another power port for rear passengers. Again, this is before power ports and devices became so commonplace. It's surprising to see that in the back seat, but that's what they've done here. A luxury car deserves all the luxury features. In this rear area, you can also see these cup holders that have kind of broken, but they're down here. They came out of the center console. You'd fold them out for cup holders. You also had ashtrays built into the rear doors, where you can further see more wood trim in the back, another nice touch. And you have this center armrest that folds down, and it's much more than just an armrest. As you can see, it contains some cup holders for more drink storage capabilities, and you also have a storage compartment. You lift this lid and you have that, but there's also this. What is this? The answer, it's a tissue holder. You would take tissues, you'd take them out of the box, and you would stuff them into here, and then you had a tissue dispenser feature in the backseat of your Escalade or your Tahoe. They've completely done away with this feature in modern cars, but it was kind of a neat thing. Some parents enjoyed it in the old ones. Now, also worth pointing out back here, you have on the ceiling your rear climate controls. You cannot change the temperature, but you can change the fan speed, and you can adjust the position of these vents for air blowing on you. You also have rear lighting. As you can see, these little buttons allow you to turn on sort of rear reading lights that were integrated into the ceiling that allowed you to read maps or books or whatever sitting in the back. There was a surprising amount of equipment and features in the backseat of the Escalade. It was a luxurious car. And next up, we move on to the cargo area in the original Escalade. But before we do that, we got to talk rear configuration, which was one of the major options that you could choose when you were ordering one of these. Back then, they offered it two ways. You could get a traditional tailgate that lifted up, or you could get rear barn doors like this Escalade has. And you can see these doors open separately and individually out to the sides. Now, there were advantages to either system depending on what you were looking for. The barn doors could open further. And in fact, there's a little trick with the hinge on the barn doors where you can sort of unattach it and then open the door all the way so you can get like massive pieces of plywood or other big items into the back. The barn doors also meant that you didn't have to open or close a heavy tailgate. It was obviously a lot easier to open and close these simple doors. But the drawback of the rear barn doors was no rear wiper, which you had on the tailgate. The barn doors were split in two, so you couldn't do it. And the barn doors had a big post going down the center where they latched together, which kind of hampered rear visibility. By the next Escalade, the barn doors were gone. The tailgate became the only way you could do it, which obviously remains true to this day. Now, once you got into the cargo area, one interesting thing in here, there's no third row seating. The original Escalade, the first generation model, was 2-row, 5 seats only. No third row was available. Third row Escalades came later, but Cadillac, I guess at the time, didn't think people would really be using these for family transport, and other luxury SUVs were 2 rows, so that's what they went with. The result is an absolutely massive cargo area. You can see it's huge, and owing to the boxy design of this vehicle, it's huge even from a ceiling height. It's tall and wide and big and just really massive. You can put basically anything you want back here. Although it's worth pointing out, you don't really get any cargo area tricks. There's no like hidden compartments or storage under the floor or power outlets or folding seats. It's just a big old space, it's carpeted, where you can put a lot of stuff. And a few other interesting things worth pointing out about this Escalade. For one, what did it cost? You might be wondering, how expensive was the original Escalade? The answer, starting price was around $46,000 back in '99. And if you adjust for inflation, that equates to around $90,000 in today's money, which coincidentally is the starting price of the new Escalade. So the new Escalade costs about the same as it always did, although the new one is a considerably better vehicle. It's pretty impressive what they've been able to do for the same money all these years later. But the Escalade has always kind of been at this price point. The other interesting thing about the Escalade is, of course, what happened next. Probably the most surprising thing about these OG Escalades is they were not on sale for very long. General Motors was so worried about being beaten to market by the '98 Lincoln Navigator that they rushed to market in '99 with the Escalade, even though they knew the Tahoe was getting redesigned in '01, and they were going to be able to come out with a much better vehicle based on that next generation Tahoe. So this initial Escalade was just a 2-year model, and it was a stopgap. They just came out with it only to get an Escalade to market while they were working on the next one, which was significantly better. The second generation Escalade came out for '02, and it was far more distinct from the Tahoe, had its own complete design, exterior and interior, and really helped to grow the Escalade brand, unlike the first one, which was pretty much just a dressed up Tahoe. After that, of course, it was off to the races. We now have another brand new Escalade that recently came out, it is still a hugely popular vehicle, and it remains a cultural icon and a favorite among people who want a big old luxury SUV with brawny styling and a lot of character and personality. The Escalade has been that for 25 years. It still carries that mantle, and this is where it started. And of course, the success of the Navigator, and especially the Escalade, meant that other brands wanted to join in, and they did pretty soon. Infiniti launched the full-size QX56 in 2004-2005. The Audi Q7 and Mercedes GL came out in 2007. BMW finally came out with the X7 in 2019. And of course, as the years went by, the Range Rover and the Lexus LX were softened from their off-road persona to kind of more match the on-road muscular luxury thing that the Escalade and Navigator started back in the late 90s. This was the beginning of a cultural storm, the full-size luxury SUV. And now, let's get it out on the road and see how the OG Escalade drives. All right, driving the OG Escalade. And my first reaction 2 seconds into this drive is, I can't believe how much this feels like an OG Tahoe. The Escalade now is such an important property for Cadillac. I mean, so much that they changed the names of all their other vehicles multiple times now and always left Escalade because it was such a strong brand. But back in this era, they didn't know what was going to happen, and so they just sort of dressed up a Tahoe, and they didn't really dress it up all that much. And so when I say that, I mean, obviously it's a lot nicer in here. You have leather seats and the wood steering wheel and a lot more features and all that. But like, the sound of the powertrain is probably the thing that surprises me the most. Like, it's loud. And a modern Escalade, so much effort goes into making sure that it is the quietest experience possible. But back in this era, they were like, that's the Tahoe motor, just, you know, put some nicer stuff on it and just run with it. And that's what they did. And so that's what you have. And the ride quality, same situation. It is pretty wild to me how this rides. Like, it rides like an old body on frame GM SUV. I mean, I've driven every GM SUV from this era many, many times, spent tons of time in Tahoes, but also the pickup trucks and all that. And this is just how it rides. Like, I'm sure there was, I mean, you know, this car's got 130,000 miles, so stuff's worn, but I'm sure there was effort at the time that was made to make this ride way better than a Tahoe, but not that much effort, especially because they knew this body style was going away in only 2 model years. This was always just a stopgap. So as much as they wanted to do, they really didn't want to do that much. Like, even if they knew they were going to make an Escalade that was much more of a real effort, they also must have known at the time this came out that this was not that, and that they just had to come out with something and kind of make it clear that they were trying. And so that's what's happened here. Now, with all of that said, if you have experience with big SUVs from this era, it is pretty easy to understand how the Escalade took off. Because even though it is not, by modern standards, very heavily disguised compared to the Tahoe, by the standards of its day, it was the nicest thing you could possibly imagine. I mean, there were Range Rovers, that was a thing that existed, but other than that, the big luxury SUV was not really in that realm. And all those, the Range Rover and the Land Cruiser, they were all pitched as off-roaders. This was supposed to be like for driving around the city, like no off-road compromises. You just had the Tahoe, which everybody loved, but like dressed up. And it actually, for the time period, was a pretty impressive vehicle, even though by modern standards, it just, you know, it feels floaty and it feels rough riding and all that stuff. The standards of its day were totally different. I will say also, like so many GM vehicles of its era, like it's not fast, it's floaty, the ride is rough, but like it runs and drives surprisingly well. I mean, the interior kind of falls apart, like there's the plastics and everything are just, they were never attractive, but like it runs and it works. You know, this was GM's era where they were reliable in the powertrain sense, like you could just kind of keep running the car badly if you wanted to, but it just goes. And this feels like a workhorse. Of course, in the modern era, that's not what an Escalade feels like, you know, but at its time, I mean, I've driven so many of these vehicles from this era, and I understand. You could see how this could become cool. Okay, I got a Tahoe, which was already kind of a celebrated, revered, you know, vehicle for a lot of people. I got a Tahoe made by Cadillac. Like, that's just cool. They almost didn't have to do all that much to it in order to make it a pretty impressive vehicle. Overall, it's definitely an interesting trip into the past. Given what the Escalade has become, it's definitely interesting now to see where this one was. I mean, I love the experience. I love being able to get into this car and drive it and go back in time like this, because this really was a seminal car that kind of started a revolution. Nonetheless, it is pretty insane to me that you know, this was revolutionary at the time. But it was. This is what they had. This is what they had to work with, and this is what they did. And getting in this car and driving it, it's almost a bit of a surprise that it worked, considering how successful it has become, that it started from sort of such a modest thing. But it did, and it was a huge hit, and even though the Navigator came first and the Lexus LX came first, like everybody knows the Escalade. The Escalade was the hit, the first hit, the biggest hit, and still is kind of that. And this is the beginnings. It's just cool to check it out. And so that's the original Cadillac Escalade. This car was a huge deal back then, and it's still a big deal today, and now you know how it all started. And you can buy this Escalade on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the original Escalade a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 42 out of 100, which puts the original Escalade here against rivals, dead on with the original Lincoln Navigator, which was its closest rival at the time. The Navigator wins in the daily categories, which makes sense as it was a bit more comfortable and more practical, but the Escalade wins the weekend categories as it's more stylish and cooler. Overall, neither of these cars are very desirable or very luxurious by modern standards, but they both set the tone for a full-size luxury SUV explosion in the following years.